Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mind Split Cafe. And as you can tell, today we are Matless. He is a little tied up. But today we're doing a part two with two of our favorite people, Dr. Weiner and Dr. Foti. And we're doing a part two of Kratom. So, how's it going today, guys?
Gonna be better.
I'm pretty well.
Good, good. So, as everyone knows, Dr. Foti, you're a DO, and Dr. Weiner, you are an addiction specialist, addiction psychologist. And we did have a part one of Kratom, and we just kind of ran out of time because of how in depth that we can get with this topic and this substance. So, I first want to start off by letting you guys take the floor. Is there anything that you want to add or kind of start off with, and then we can start with the questioning?
I'll
Not on
just
my
say
end.
that I appreciate being able to talk about this, the front end, and anyone taking the time to listen. I mean, I remember I was at a conference, gosh, this was maybe a couple months back, and someone comes up and is like, hey, have you heard of this thing called Mad Honey? Which I had not actually heard that there's basically like a psychedelic honey now that's being sold that you can just buy online. It's like from some special bees in like Nepal or something like that. But I was like, wow, okay, this is interesting. And there've been a couple journal articles about it and all that. And just it was a reminder that there's always something new to keep your eye out for, and particularly when we cross it with capitalism, which I know was a big theme of our first episode. And I'm just really thankful for the opportunity to have the discussion put on people's radars so they're not surprised by it when they encounter it in the wild.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of seems like every day there's a new legal substance that mimics a illegal substance. It's kind of crazy, and it always seems to slip through the cracks. So absolutely, I'm glad that we can jump on here and go over this topic because it is something that's out there, and it's something that a lot of people are it, using for good reasons, or at least they feel that it's good reasons, and even just using it as a substance. So I'm definitely glad that we can get on here and break down some of the aspects of it. So, Dr. Foti, did you want to throw anything in there real quick?
No, just I think echoing what Dr. Weiner said, I'm really happy to be here to discuss this. I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think that while we're talking about kratom, I think we can really apply a lot of this discussion we're going to have with a lot of those substances, like Dr. Weiner mentioned, the mad honey and other types of herbal substances and whatnot that have these effects that are going to need a lot of studying and before they're applied. And I think, this is a bigger discussion than kratom, but kratom today will be kind of the example because it is within that realm a bit of a hot topic. So yeah, happy to discuss it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So, this first question, I'm gonna go with Dr. Foti on this side, and Dr. Weiner, I'm positive you can throw some light on this question as well. So, by all means, if you want to jump in on this one as well, the way we do things is kind of organic type of conversation. So, by all means, you can jump in as well. But as we know, kratom is known to interact with the opioid receptors, and but it also has alkaloids that influences and causes effects. Can you guys explain how this compound works and how it becomes a stimulant and a kind of a downer at the same time, depending on dosage?
Yes. So that's a big area of study right now. So the thought is that again, the opioid-like effects, or is it the fact that it partially activates the same receptor that opiates do, right? Though it's called the mu opioid receptor. Now, the more stimulant-like effects, again, still being studied, but it's thought that it's due to interaction with what are called adrenergic receptors. So these are um, basically receptors where our natural adrenaline within our body bind to, as well as other receptors such as serotonin and dopamine, which are all arousal type receptors, right? Now, anecdotally, again, this is anecdotally, it's thought that at smaller doses, you get more of that stimulant-like effect, and at larger doses, you get the more opiate-like effect. But again, that's not been proven, and that's exactly what they're studying. And this is all specifically that, as we discussed on part one, the mitragynine, which gets broken down into 7-hydroxymitragynine, is how it really produces these effects.
That's interesting to me, and it's the same substance. It just in higher doses works off different receptors. Did I understand that correctly?
That's what it thought, and when I say anecdotally, it's that these are people who are using it and telling us that when they've taken less, they've gotten this type of effects, meaning, heart racing and, more aroused type feeling, whereas at larger doses, they got more of the pain relief potentially, as well as more sedative effects. But this hasn't been proven yet, um, in terms of the research that, organizations like NIDA are doing at the moment.
That's interesting. And Dr. Weiner, I know that we kind of brought this up on the last episode, and despite all the negative effects or the negative things out there surrounding kratom, a lot of people use this and even think that this is a safe alternative for opiate use. And some people even use it to kind of get off the harder stuff and then end up becoming addicted to this one. Can you kind of go over how that is, and kind of like what the withdrawals are, and how they are kind of the same in some senses?
Yeah. Well, so because it acts on those mu opioid receptors, it means that you could theoretically, and that theoretically part is that word's doing a lot of work here because we don't know specifically how it works or how long and half-life and all that. But you could use it to dampen, say, an opioid withdrawal effect, or you could use it to try to get some pain-sparing effects. And that's how people are trying to essentially self-medicate with this product right now is try to either substitute it in or use it instead or transition from one to another. The problem is though that an opioid is an opioid. And so there are dependency issues. There are the withdrawal issues. Back when I was running addiction service line for a hospital, we opened up a buprenorphine clinic, and we had people coming in there because of kratom. Like that was actually something that I personally have seen. People need to move on to buprenorphine because they were using so much kratom every day that they were going into withdrawal from opioids. So it is something where, whenever you're kind of going off the beaten path and trying to use psychoactive substances to either manage the side effects of other substances or treat your condition without medical supervision. I don't know. I know I'm conservative about this, but I think that's playing with fire. That's why we have folks like Dr. Foti who are, they've gotten a degree and a license and board certified, like those sorts of things. And I think it's important that we work with professionals on it. But that being said, if you have been if you've been using enough kratom that you develop an opioid dependency syndrome with them, essentially, what that withdrawal looks like is essentially kind of like a really bad flu. You're vomiting, you've got some shakes, you have difficulty sleeping, edgy, irritability, lower GI distress, body temperature regulation issues. It's just very, very, very uncomfortable. Not going to kill you as far as we can tell, but very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm glad you brought up the buprenorphine clinic and people actually coming in for kratom, because that was going to be one of my next questions. Is so, what does treatment look like for kratom use disorder or kratom use and going through withdrawal? And it seems to be just what you mentioned. It's the same as opiate. You feel the same things, but is the intensity the same? Is the kind of withdrawal time frame the same as well? I mean, and Dr. Foti, you can chime in on this one as well, because I kind of feel like it lays in both your realms.
I'll put out there, and I'd be interested in hearing Dr. Foti's opinion because, to be honest, I haven't been in that hospital environment for like 5 years now, and I think the market around mitragynine in particular has grown a lot. I should mention as well, the concern is less of like the herb-based stuff. I remember actually at one point I was looking at the I was watching a YouTube video of someone who was talking about his descent into a kratom addiction. And he said at one point he was just consuming so much plant matter that he was vomiting all the time. And, like just to try to get as much of that active ingredient, just like that delivery method wasn't working. So now we have shots, right? We have liquids, we have concentrates. So the delivery, you can get a lot more of the active ingredient in a much more palatable package, which I think leads to another tier of risk. So I'd be interested to hear if that's changed then in terms of the symptoms that people are experiencing. But personally, my experience is that it's been just in many ways like any other short-acting opioid, where people will go into withdrawal within a day if they don't get it. The amount of buprenorphine, say someone would need, the number of milligrams would be related to the amount of opioids they were consuming. And you know use the normal induction protocol, getting someone onto buprenorphine to find the right dose. But I'm definitely interested in hearing Dr. Foti's experience with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I will say, in terms of in practice and personal experience, I haven't had patients who've used it or had to try to kind of wean them off of anything in terms of being on kratom. From the research I've done as well, I haven't seen a specific guideline to say, oh, we need to use this if someone becomes addicted to kratom, because it's so new. And again, it's not even something that's FDA approved as, for medicinal use, right? Now, it does bring up that point, though, that the reason that it is, but we say, why are we even doing research on it then? Well, it's not just because people are using it, but it could potentially have medicinal effects if we're able to extract the compound, study it, find a particular dose that works for this type of kind of weaning someone off opiates who has an opioid use disorder, right? So, and treating withdrawal. So, the reason being that it appears on initial studies that the concern is with kratom use long term, it could have serious adverse effects, such as liver failure, as we talked about in part one, right? So the thought is, well, if this is partially activating the opioid receptor, it could potentially act in some way to help someone with opioid use disorder or withdrawal to get them off of it. Well, in that respect, we'd only need to use it in the short term. So we could potentially avoid those serious adverse effects. And that's why it's being studied. However, what they need to figure out is the dose and a specific dose, right, of any potential, you know, future FDA approved formulation that would produce the opioid like effect as opposed to the stimulant like effect, right? And also not lead to, or at least try to reduce the addictive potential as much as possible, right? Because now you're just fighting fire with fire at that point.
Yeah.
So that is a very, very active area of research to say, can we extract the mitragynine, figure out a dose that produces partially activating opioid-like effects, and use it for opioid use disorder and withdrawal. But again, the concern being is that there's so many formulations out there. Many of these have contaminants. Many of these have other compounds. There's not a standardized dose yet because it's not been approved for medicinal use. But really, no one should be using it yet for anything until studies led by doctors actually figure out, is this something we can use for medicinal use?
And if I could chime in,
Yeah.
actually, so something that would so you agree with everything that you're saying in terms of like what the process would look like, and part of what always makes me wonder about this is like that would take a lot of effort, and ultimately, like when I think about what opioid maintenance medications, what how they work, it's because they have a long half-life. Right, methadone's a full agonist, buprenorphine's a partial agonist. For listeners who aren't familiar, it has to do with how strongly it triggers the receptor. But with mitragynine, right, we're talking about a full agonist short term. You might as well do like a Norco taper, hydrocodone taper. It feels like we're saying like we want to sell this product. So let's back engineer something where we can find some way to have a full agonist, even a weak one, but a full agonist opioid receptor, like to make this work. And it feels like, I mean, I guess maybe if we're trying to find some way to sell kratom or mitragynine, but I don't know. I think the long half life. When I think about opioid maintenance, like there's a reason why people take methadone once a day, take buprenorphine once a day, and that gets them through to tomorrow. And personally, I think that if that's the way kratom worked, now we'd be onto something. But that's not how kratom works.
Oh,
Yeah.
I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. It kind
Sorry,
of
Chris, I
seems
didn't mean to
that.
interrupt.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Foti.
No, I was just going to add real quick. That's the issue. It is partially activating, but you need something that's a long-acting compound. So unless they can, work with that compound and somehow make it long-acting and maintain its partial agonist activity, I agree, you're not really working something that's going to help. But that is why they are researching because they do like the partial agonist effect of it, and that's why they're researching it. But again, that's why we're not approved for anything at the moment. Sorry, Chris, to interrupt.
No, no, no problem at all. And Dr. Weiner, you mentioned something about just trying to sell something. They're kind of trying to make a reason to sell it. And it kind of leads into, we kind of discussed this last time and with some of our other episodes, but it kind of seems like a lot of these places are playing off people's psychology and even addiction, saying, "Hey, it can help you with this. It's a replacement for opiates," and it's about the almighty dollar. And how does that play into all of this? I mean, with addiction and even just the marketing of the almighty dollar kind of way.
Yeah. Well, so I was watching some like YouTube videos on kratom for I was doing a kratom presentation like 6 months a year back, and I was like, let's just see like let's actually like tap into the people, right? Like let's see if I was a regular person trying to figure out like should I take this? What might I do? I might go on YouTube, type in like what does kratom do? Is kratom an antidepressant? And watch some videos from people like kind of giving testimonials. And I remember that there was one guy in particular who was talking about his experiences with it and was saying like I was told that kratom could be an antidepressant, and so I started using it, and to be honest, didn't work for me. Like it really didn't do anything, and I think that that's where again evidence matters so much because it was being marketed in one way. He's out there saying like my anecdotal experience is that it didn't work for me, but that's part of why we have the FDA review process. And it's also not to say like if we found a good use for mitragynine, like if you could use that, and it was my mistake actually, I didn't realize it was a partial agonist and not a full one. But if we could say, well, it's got these properties, maybe we can find some way to leverage this into another option other than buprenorphine. Yeah, I mean, great. Like more tools are wonderful. It feels like though, particularly when you have like I don't know, I kind of pick on these guys because it's just so ridiculous. But like if you go to like Happy Hippo, which is a kratom distribution website that's clearly marketing to young people, if not just overtly kids with like the cartoons and everything. And you look at that and say, okay, so this is the tail that's wagging the dog right now. Ultimately, like are companies like this who have this product, who have this distribution pipeline. I even got an ad at one point. I got like someone DMing me like, hey, do you want to buy like it was like a ton, literally a ton of kratom. Like someone was asking if I want to buy this wholesale to open a store, and because you can do that right now because it's not illegal to do that. You can
Yeah, it's legal.
buy literally a ton of kratom and go sell it. That's those forces are at play right now, and I think that it's tough when that's already moving, right, and that's moving forward, and trying to then pivot to say, well, why don't we push this through a regulatory process instead, and why don't we have studies that aren't funded by industry that validate certain perspectives? It's just tougher to do.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And kind of staying on the addiction side, how does regular kratom use impact mental health or even pre-existing psychiatric or mental health conditions? I mean, would that like exacerbate it, make it worse, or I mean, I would assume it would, right?
Well, I'll say I'll put this out there, and I'll like, I've been talking for a while, so I want to make sure I hand them the mic back to Dr. Foti. But I was looking at a study that was examining the impact of kratom on functioning, and they were actually finding because oftentimes the people who are using kratom, it's a polypharmacy issue. It's not just one thing. It's they're using other things and then also kratom. They were finding that people who endorsed kratom use actually had higher issues on drug, basically drug and substance related severity indexes in terms of the negative consequences in their life. The single substance actually that was highest on that list in association was kratom, but not because kratom itself causes all the problems, but because most people who use it are also struggling with mental health or also struggling with other addictions. So it certainly is not going to make it better. I guess I'll just end by saying the the psychological process of addiction is I feel a certain way, whether or not it's withdrawal or emotional or whatnot. I feel a certain way, and I'm going to change that with a chemical. And that underlying mechanism doesn't care what chemical or behavior. It could be pornography, it could be something else too. But I'm going to change my mental status with a behavior or a chemical. And as long as that's the routine and the behavior, that's really the core issue. So if you're using kratom in that way, I wouldn't necessarily think it's helpful at all. If anything, it's just continuing to beat down that path and make it harder potentially to stop being addicted to other things. But from that's again just purely a psychological standpoint, that would be my take on it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Dr. Foti, do you have any ideas on that as well?
Yeah, no, and I agree with everything that Dr. Weiner's saying. You know, it's the within the mental health realm, what I've seen is about self-treating for anxiety, but the only reason this could or is even thought of for that is the sedative effects, right, of kratom, right? But sedation doesn't treat anxiety, it treats the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
This is why we know that for generalized anxiety disorder, the number one gold standard treatment is a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy plus an SSRI and SNRI, not Xanax, right? Not, any sedative, right? So, and then to add to that, what Dr. Weiner was talking about, yes, kratom has been found to be a component of those who are unfortunately struggling with polysubstance abuse. So because of that, it's not, oh, one person feels a bit anxious and they're trying kratom. A lot of the times it's being used with several other recreational drugs, and that's the issue. It's compounding the issue as opposed to treating it. And to go back to what you brought up a great point, Chris, about the financial aspect of this, if it's okay if I touch on that.
Yeah, no,
If we
absolutely.
all if we all remember when cigarettes first came out, it was marketed as something to treat stress and anxiety, and now we know that it causes cancer, right?
Yeah.
There's always a financial incentive here, right? You have a compound that someone doesn't have to go to the doctor for, get a prescription for, and it's being marketed as something to treat anxiety, pain, and so many other things, right? So why would someone not want to jump on that, and why would someone not make $1 million off of it either, right? Just like
Yeah.
anything else that's being marketed for weight loss, hair loss, anything that skips the doctor's office. But what I'm trying to im really implore your audience to understand is if it has to skip the doctor, you shouldn't be going for it,
That's a
okay?
very good
What
point.
right? Yeah. This is, and again, if whether you distrust federal agencies or not, that's a whole other discussion. I'm talking about science, going through research, making sure that this is safe and effective for what we want it to be safe and effective for. And I agree with your audience who may say, well, there's a lot of things we still haven't been studied, but there doesn't mean that just Western medicine is enough. I agree with you. I'm not. There's a lot more out there that we need to learn about that likely will make it into the fold in terms of medicines, but let it go through the process first so that it is formulated in a safe way and for what we want it to be used for if it will make it to that point, right? Let it go through the science, the randomized controlled trials, and then we can say, okay, now we know that it's relatively safe, when we're talking about risk benefit here, right? So, sorry, I wanted to touch on that because I know it was a really great question you brought up, and it's a really great point.
Yeah, no, I think it's wild. Good, very good point, and I think it's wild that someone can get in their car and drive 5 minutes down the street to a smoke shop and get something for their pain, their addiction issues, their anxiety. Like that's crazy to me. You're talking to a teenager that's behind the counter selling you something that is going to help this. That blows my mind.
Right,
Well,
right.
it just to happen with one other quick thing too. I think that there's the issue of the research, but then also you could just acknowledge that it's experimental, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
what we're missing too, right? That we don't know what it's going to do. The other part though also is that because it's not regulated, who knows what you're actually buying? And I think
Yes.
that's the other layer of the capitalism. Like I'm not making it up. Someone DM'd me and offered me to buy 2,000 pounds of kratom.
Good God.
Is it kratom really? Is it the strain that they say it is? What content of my tragedy is there? Who the heck knows? I could say whatever I want and put it in a baggie and sell it to people, and that's the regulatory environment. So I think there's that extra little wiggle too when it comes to the actual practical aspect of someone obtaining and using this stuff right now.
Yeah, it's not like that person has a license to lose like a pharmacy would have or a doctor would have that's prescribing you something. That's a very valid point. It's it's
They
kind
could
of
also
like what
just,
happened. Go ahead.
sorry, no, no, go ahead. No, please finish your thought.
No, I was just gonna say it's kind of what happened, and I may be mistaken on this, but I think it was like the mushroom gummies that have like Delta in there and some sort of like legal mushroom, but they were putting too much of it in there, and all these people were getting sick, and there was like a really big recall. I mean, that's the same concept. It's the same thing. You're having, some guy that may have a degree, may not have a degree, putting this together and wrapping it up in a bag and saying, "Hey, go sell this for me." It's kind of crazy.
And they can run it almost like a circus. If everyone in town doesn't want to buy it anymore, they'll close up shop, move somewhere else, and start selling it again, right?
Yeah,
and it's just going to keep hurting and hurting people until they'll just keep moving their way around the country.
Yep. There's no license to lose. There's nothing tying them to it. They can run away and put a different name on it.
100%.
So, I've done a lot of research on this myself. By no means am I the expert. You guys are the expert, and that's why you're here. But some of the research I've done on it is that kratom does have a lower risk of respiratory depression than opiates. But there's got to be some sort of like, obviously, there's misuse associated with it, but kratom toxicity, there's got to be something. You take too much, maybe you won't die. Maybe, I guess it would be considered an overdose when you take too much. You may or may not die, but there's got to be something with kratom toxicity. Do you have an idea of what that looks like? And both of you, this question's for both of you, obviously.
If it's okay, Dr. Weiner, I was going to chime in real quick. I think, again, this goes back to actually what Dr. Weiner mentioned, right? We're working in a theoretical realm here. So theoretically, of what we know about it, because it is a thought to be a partial agonist of this receptor, it should not cause significant respiratory depression. Can we say that for 100% certainty? No, right? Because it still needs to be understood at that biochemical level before we could say, yes, it does not, which we can't say that right now, right? Also, even we get to a point, anything that has an opioid-like effect, when taken in enough amount, can of course cause respiratory depression, right? Because even if it is just partially activating a receptor, yeah, well, if you maybe this amount doesn't cause it, but maybe this amount does cause respiratory depression, right? Just to speak in analogies here, right? It's all relative. So let me just say that it's not enough is known to say for sure. We
Mhm.
do know that it can cause serious liver failure, among many other things. But respiratory depression, again, just theoretically and anecdotally, it's thought to likely not cause as much respiratory depression, but we don't know for sure.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
I think that's entirely right. There's been a couple recorded cases of death due to overdose in kratom, but it's much more rare, I'd say by percentage, because it's a partial agonist. But yeah, opioid's an opioid. At a certain point, it can shut it down.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I don't know if I have this question completely formulated in my head, but it has to do with addiction. And, when someone's on an opiate, it's very hard to get them off, both mentally and physically, because of the withdrawals. And then just mentally, you obviously got onto an opiate because you like the way it felt, or you continue to use it because you like the way it felt, or it made you numb to certain things. And we may be kind of backtracking on this, but kratom obviously does the same thing, and it kind of gives you the same feeling, I'm assuming. But getting off of it physically, we have established is pretty much the same as an opiate. But what about mentally and fighting that craving and that mental addiction of it, not just the physical dependency?
I'll just add, and I'll let Dr. Weiner take the reins on this for sure. This is definitely more within your wheelhouse, but it has opiate-like effects. It activates those receptors. It has an addictive potential. And I think Dr. Weiner mentioned this earlier, there's plenty of case reports out there that support that there is that addictive potential for it. And I wonder, and again, we don't know this yet, and I think it was mentioned earlier, we don't know the half-life, meaning how long it stays in your system, all these different things that can raise the addictive potential. Because if it does remain quite short quite short amount of time within your system, you're going to need it again and again and again and again, as opposed to more of these long acting opiates. So there's definitely that concern.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before I give the answer, I pause there. So we can cut this part out. I do have a patient. I don't know if it was supposed to be scheduled for an hour or half an hour, but I gotta run in just a second because I've got someone waiting for me. So
Yeah,
it's okay.
we'll end it up with this. After you answer this, I'll see if there's anything you guys want to add, and then we'll close it up.
Marvelous, and I'll be happy to respond to the question too. But I just want to put that in there because it's like, oh man, I
Yeah.
forgot.
No, it
Uh,
was only supposed to be 30 minutes, but I love this stuff. I love talking with you guys, so I apologize. But we'll start it in 3 seconds. I'll do a countdown. You can answer. Three, two, one.
Yeah. So in terms of, like I said, I'm saying this a lot today. Dr. Foti's right on all counts. I think ultimately, It's similar to this has been our echo a bit today, is that it's similar to other opioids, it's similar to other substances. I wouldn't say that there's anything particularly different on a psychological level about it. The more oftentimes you use something to moderate your mood, the more it can build that sense of reliance. Addiction in general is always about this substance becomes a pillar of your life. And it's very difficult then from an emotional standpoint to walk away from it. You feel like you need it, or your your mental world starts to crumble. So yeah, I think it's really just a matter of degrees. I think for you to have like a major problem with kratom, at least if you're using the plant, you're going to have to use a lot of it. If you're using though like the concentrates, again, that's where things start to get a little bit wigglier, because you might not have to use too much of that in order to get to a higher point of addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that's, I know we're running out of time. I just want to make one more point, and it just kind of tails off of what you just said is you're going to have to start using more of it. A lot of the articles I've read is that the longer you use it, the more and more you have to use, which goes with pretty much any substance. You know, you want that desired effect. You got to continuously use more of it. But I've heard that when you use kratom more and more, and the more you use of it in one sitting, you kind of start getting these weird physical feelings like your eyes are bouncing around and you kind of get like a double vision. There's some articles that I've seen on it. It's super crazy to me. And maybe we can touch base on that a little bit later. But again, I know we're running out of time. So I just want to give you guys the floor real quick. Is there anything else you guys want to add on there real quick before we shut down and call it quits for the day?
I'll just say I know again there's a push for different alternative medicines, and I think that is a big part of this too. But listen to your doctor, uh, wait for the research, advocate for the research if you really want to push for something like this before taking anything. And obviously everything that we've said here, is purely educational and not advice from either Dr. Weiner or myself in terms of clinical advice. So do your research, advocate for it if you'd like, before you do anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Weiner?
Yeah, well, I would definitely echo. This is all informational and not clinical advice for sure, on so many levels in terms of this topic. But yeah, it's just go in with eyes open is really always my advice on this sort of situation where people get to decide, particularly without regulation, whether or not they expose their bodies to these sorts of things. Be particularly, I'd say, skeptical if you're a teenager or a young person, because then your brain isn't done developing, and there's extra implications in terms of life course there if you use substances like this at an early age. But just know we don't have the research yet, and keep your eyes open for. I know not everything trickles out to mainstream media, and sometimes it's hard to get to the medical journals. But maybe tune into Mind Split Cafe. Maybe we'll talk more
There we
about that
go.
as the news comes out.
Now that is good advice right there. I love it.
I agree with that.
All right. Well, I appreciate you guys jumping on for this part too. We always love having you. You guys are definitely fan favorites and favorites of Mind Split Cafe. So I do appreciate it. And to everyone else, we'll see you next week.